Hello everyone, this is Tammy, Sankofa Traveler, and welcome to Black Race Matter. I know it's been a minute, but I am back, been doing a lot of traveling, and you know I am a cemetery traveler and historian, so I just want to do a quick video before the end of the summer, and I'm so excited to have two great individuals here to talk about the history of Pleasant Garden Cemetery in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So we have Beth Murphy and Donivan Brown. You two, thank you so much. I reached out to you, I think a couple of months ago or last year, and I decided, hey, let me try again because I've been to that cemetery before. I was there for the unveiling of the Ed Johnson statue. So it was just a wonderful event, and I was like, I have to definitely get you both on to talk to you. So before we could go into talking about the cemetery, if both of you can tell me your background.
Beth, how about you go first?
Oh, you want me to start? Okay, well, I'm actually originally from Kentucky. Then when all my kids were grown up, left the house, I moved to Memphis. Also, my daughter lived there, and I had a younger brother who lived there. So lived there for several years. And then about 8-9 years ago, I moved here to Chattanooga, again, following that same daughter. And so I've been here since, I guess, about 2017. I'm a retired school social worker, was doing genealogy, and in Memphis, I went to a class about restoring and preserving headstones and that type of thing, and I was kind of like hooked. And so when I moved to Chattanooga, there was an article in the newspaper about this old cemetery, Pleasant Garden Cemetery. And it was also talking about Ed Johnson was buried there. And so I reached out to the person that wrote it because I was like, I was going to volunteer to work in a cemetery. Well, long story short, I ended up working on the Ed Johnson project. And that's how I met Donivan. And I guess ever since then, we've been working at the cemetery. So, yeah.
Thank you, Beth. Mr. Brown, can you tell me your background?
Sure. Well, I was born in Texas in the late 70s in a cross-shaped hospital. My parents could not decide my name. I'm going way back. They couldn't decide upon my name. So initially, my first legal name was Baby Boy. That's how they did it in the state of Texas. Eventually, we moved back to the place of their upbringing, which was a town called Gastonia, which is about 20 minutes outside of Charlotte. And as parents do and married couples do, they did get divorced. My mom, however, remarried a few years later, a man who lived in Chattanooga, Tennessee. We migrated here in the mid-1980s, coming to find out several years ago that we were actually the first Black folks to live in our neighborhood. So we were groundbreaking. I didn't even quite understand that as a child, that we were the first Black people here. So African-American family, white neighborhood, Black church across town in these small private Christian schools that were predominantly white. And then in the late mid-90s, went to college in Chicago, lived there for 8 years. And throughout my time in school, you know, we've heard that they're math people and they're science people, but I was essentially a history person. I don't know what it was about me. I was sort of drawn to the narrative and into the detail, into the context woven into what we consider to be history. Now, I definitely recognize in college that there were some massive voids in what I was taught about history, particularly where I'd come from, in my experience here, my family's experience here. There were tidbits that my family wove into my experience, but it wasn't until I got into college where I started to learn more. Moved back in 2004, June 1st, 04. And years later, I was working at a nonprofit in the city. It was late 2016. It was an intern there who indicated that a professor she was affiliated with at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga was a part of a group of citizens who had organized to honor the victims of lynching in our community. And it was, for me, it was like record scratch, you know what I'm saying? I was like, what do you mean? Like, how could I've lived here all these years that no one in my entire family, no one in my city had ever expressed and ever communicated that there were lynchings here? So she said it was a man named Ed Johnson. I looked him up online and come to find out that he was buried in an African-American cemetery. So that weekend, me and the guy I used to work with, we went out and hustled and found the cemetery. And it was astonishing. I lived here most of my life, and somehow there was this hidden, nearly 20-acre cemetery that I had never been to before, that many people actually don't even know existed. So he and I walked around for quite some time, and we could clearly see the depressions where graves are sunken into the ground, and in some areas it was overgrown. We did find Ed Johnson's grave shortly thereafter. With the work I was doing, we invited in members of the Ed Johnson Project to a group I was working with around racial equity. And then I became a member of the Ed Johnson Project, and then became the chair in late 2020, and served beyond the time of dedication. It was a great honor and privilege. I mean, in essence, like, so I turned 46 back in April, and I'm still healing from my past. Our country was born in 1776, but it was comprised of the original 13. And I think I've been relatively diligent in healing from my past, and I'm not sure the country has. And I would contend that what we see at Pleasant Garden Cemetery, along with other abandoned or derelict African American cemeteries, it's about the country healing from its past. And so I, along with Beth, began organizing work at Pleasant Garden Cemetery in 2017. Have to shout out a guy named David Young, who lives adjacent to the cemetery, had been the effective primary caretaker for 35 years. He spent thousands of hours of his life, thousands of dollars, and different groups started and stopped along the years from community efforts, but David was the most consistent and vibrant member of the community who sought the care of Pleasant Garden Cemetery. So that's a bit about my background. I mean, currently what I do vocationally and or civically, in one respect or the other, is all rooted around truth telling, grief, death, and healing. I direct the Community Psychological Trauma Center. Of course, I'm a member of the African American Cemetery Preservation Fund. I do some consulting. I'm actually consulting with the Trust for Public Land in the state of Tennessee on abandoned cemetery that was actually run by the county from 1890 to 1912, and then walked away from it. It's mostly comprised of African Americans. It was in essence a mass grave. We have U.S. colored troops buried there. We've got Alfred Blunt, first man lynched on the Walnut Street Bridge, is buried there. And we're seeking to bring remedy to what has historically been a dire situation and remains one.
Okay. So can you discuss about the history of the Pleasant Garden Cemetery?
Well, we had another one of our team members just join. Lois Luster is just joined us.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. And yourself?
I'm doing pretty good. Is there anything you'd like to say or talk about your background or anything?
Well, my background basically with the cemetery. I come from a sales background. My job has always been in sales. I have a personal interest in the cemetery. I have family members buried there. And I've been looking for the cemetery for years and never could find it. Never could find the cemetery. And one morning I got up, I said, I'm going to find the cemetery today if it takes me all day. Just happened, I saw a lady jogging and I asked her, I said, would you by chance know where Pleasant Garden Cemetery is? And she said, the African American Cemetery? And I said, yes, ma'am. And she said, it's in my neighborhood. And I said, okay. So she told me to go up Charlotteford Road, turn right on Ridgeside, go up a little bit, turn right on Road, and go down the road. And so I said, okay. So I followed her directions. But when I got there, I saw another cemetery that, and I'm like, this is not, doesn't say Pleasant Gardens. So something told me, well, just walk and see. So I happened to go up this little embankment, just a little step up, and I saw tombstones, what have you. And so I said, well, maybe this is the back part of the cemetery. So I proceeded to walk and walk and walk. So maybe after I had walked about 30, 45 minutes and I saw the condition of the cemetery, there were, as Donivan expressed, there were sunken graves. There was looked like a casket coming up through the ground. There was broken tombstones, and there were trees that had broken those tombstones. So there was a log there. and I sat on the log and I cried for about 30, 45 minutes, just crying. So I took out my phone and I called my brother and I said, I found the cemetery. He said, well, did you find our great grandmothers, our great great grandmothers? I have a cousin buried there and I have a brother buried there. I said, I can't find any of their graves. And I looked in the vicinity where I thought they would be because they died like in between like 59 and 65, 66. So I figured they would be in that little vicinity. So I didn't see it. And a lot of those tombstones were crushed by trees. And so there were some smaller ones, and I set them up and put dirt up against them, hoping that that's where they belonged. And my brother, he was like, who owns the cemetery? And I said, I don't know. I don't know. So I sat there for a few more minutes and I prayed and I asked the Lord to help me find out who owns the cemetery or who knows who I can get in contact with, because I wanted to start an effort to get the community involved with cleaning up the cemetery, because I didn't want my loved ones to lay in slumber like that. So I looked on Facebook and I sent out a message, and immediately I got a response. And I think it was Beth that had responded to me. And they invited me to come out for the first cleanup effort. And I came out and I met with the guys of Macaulay, and they told me about their endeavors. And I told them, I want to be a part of this. I want to join this. And they invited me to come on board, join the committee, and be a part of this. And it means so much to me that I can be in the midst of bringing a change to something that is near and dear to my heart and my family's heart. And hopefully we can get the community involved. And there's people that probably have loved ones buried there and don't even know they have them buried there because they don't know about the cemetery. So that's how I became a part of the effort for Pleasant Garden Cemetery.
Okay, well, thank you for telling that amazing story. Very heartfelt. Thank you so much. And so, Mr. Brad, can you just talk about any about the the history of that cemetery?
Absolutely. And I definitely welcome a tag team with Beth Murphy. She holds so much information. She has worked with others in spearheading effort.
Oh, you're on mute. There you go.
It's like revving the engine and not going anywhere. Yeah, so definitely tag team with Beth and talking about the history of Pleasant Garden Cemetery.
Okay.
There is at the most prominent place, the peak of the cemetery is an obelisk. Now that obelisk, there are names of a number of prominent Chattanoogans, from postal carriers to business owners to folks related to politics, who were in essence the founding members of Pleasant Garden Cemetery. And the obelisk is actually one of those areas of the cemetery that that needs repair. It's shifted over time, perhaps due to one of our handful of earthquakes that we've had, or maybe some naughty individuals in the community. Nevertheless, the first burial was actually in May of 1891, and not too far after that, it was actually sold for back taxes. There was a moment in our community where any number of properties were declared to owe tax money. And so there's some suspicion around that. Beth, I don't know if you want to share some insights about this moment in the history of the city and what that meant for Pleasant Gardens and even other cemeteries.
Yes. So at the time, cemeteries weren't taxed. And so then this was in late 1890s, maybe about 1893, somewhere around there, in which the county all of a sudden said, well, we're going to start charging, these cemeteries taxes. And so they received back tax bills. And also other properties mysteriously were sold because they hadn't paid their back taxes. So with that being said, the owners at the time weren't able to pay those taxes. So the cemetery was sold for the first time on the steps of the courthouse. And a man, J.W. Grant, bought it at that time. He was from Alabama, and he owned it for several years. And then it was sold again in the early 1900s. And at that time, G.W. Franklin, who was a local prominent undertaker, and he owned a funeral home, he purchased the land and owned it. And I think he did most of when it originally began, the cemetery was about 10, 11 acres or so. And so when he bought it, there was an agreement basically that the cemetery wouldn't expand its borders. Well, it did. And now it's approximately, it depends on who you ask. So, and one thing I've seen like 17 acres, other reports have said 20 to 22 acres. But he began procuring land that was around it. And then, unfortunately,
Hey, Beth. But I just want to take a moment to interject really quickly about G.W. Franklin. Like his name is notable historically in the city of Chattanooga. At the time when he was alive, he was one of the most prominent Southern business people, and as an African American,
Yes, he was.
He was a community leader. He was the president of a national organization for those who ran funeral homes. He initially was working with steel, eventually was making his own mechanisms for burial. So he was a talented, skilled, incredibly successful, and was someone who was incredibly notable in the community, and his name is still renowned here in the city.
Right. And his legacy continued on with his grandkids, great-grandkids, great-great-grandkids, which they're still in the funeral business today.
Yeah. Yes. You essentially have this history of this one family that started a funeral, and then they began burying people. And so from that, I mean, a large, family history. But not only was G.W. known locally, he was also known nationally and did several speaking engagements. He was a good friend with Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington gave private eulogy for G.W.'s wife when she passed away. So, yeah, definitely a well-known individual. When G.W., after his wife died, he remarried. And unfortunately, as sometimes things happen, that marriage didn't work out very well. So they divorced. And in the divorce, to settle it, he had to basically mortgage all of the properties that he owned and all the different business entities. And I'm sure he was thinking, I'm going to live long, and, I'll recoup this and everything. Unfortunately, he didn't. And so when he died, his family ended up losing the cemetery. And it was at that time that a gentleman named Levi Young, who was also a local businessman, owned a hardware store. He purchased it, again, at a sale. And so it's the descendants of Levi Young that now own the cemetery. In about 1968, this was an interview with the Times Free Press with one of Levi Young's daughters at the time. She reported that they were no longer involved with the cemetery, and basically people who had purchased lots there could still bury people, but that the Young family would no longer be caring for the cemetery. So that basically, started the end of any caretaking and those types of things. So you'll see dates that say like that the cemetery closed in 63 or burying dates in the 60s, which it did for all practical purposes, but you'll find people buried there up into the 90s.
And in some instances, you will see joint headstones where you've got one person who passed away and they're buried there, and date of birth and also date of departure. And the name adjacent to them, there'll be no information there. So in all likelihood, they were buried somewhere else. And like Beth noted, there were some people who were scuttled in the late 60s and even into the 1990s, well after it was no longer operational.
Yeah. And also one thing that I did come across while I was walking the cemetery, there are several military personnel that are buried at the cemetery. And I don't know if this was because of segregation at that time that they weren't allowed to be buried at National Cemetery. I don't know when they were actually allowed to be buried at National Cemetery. But in essence, I would love for us to be able to, once we start our, I guess, regentrification of the cemetery, we can kind of mark those headstones and clean those up so that they can be recognized and be known that they actually served our country and that they are American soldiers. You know, that's something, another thing that played on my heartstrings as well, that, you know, they're not allowed to be, weren't allowed to be buried and laid at rest at the National Cemetery.
Okay. A question I have, is there a database of all the people that are at arrest there? Is there a database or?
So no, that's a short answer.
Yes.
So back during the 1940s, the WPA, they had a project in which they were going across the country and going in and documenting headstones and people were buried. So at that time, I'm trying to think, maybe the number, it was a low number.
Yeah, it was no
As
more than
far as-
it was no more than 550. Yeah, it wasn't quite 600
Yeah.
what they quantified. If you walk Pleasant Garden
Right.
Cemetery, your eyes will tell you thousands of
Yeah.
people are buried there.
Yep.
Thousands.
Yeah.
Thousands.
So,
Yeah.
so since then, we don't have any, there's no plat records, anything like that to go by. So right now, the thing that we're working on, and we've gotten some volunteers, a gentleman who owns a GPS company, and then our region's historic preservation planner. The plan is that we will go in and that we will map basically each plot, each, divot in the ground. And then for those that do have headstones, we'll begin also identifying those. So hopefully then one day we will have a database, at least of where graves are located for those that we know, the information on their headstone. And just hoping that that would kind of give us a better ballpark figure. Right now, we estimate probably around 10,000 people are buried there. At one time, the cemetery was also doing county burials, so paupers' graves, which that was kind of a sad kind of history in the cemetery. There were some allegations, of course, that much like the grave or the cemetery that Donivan was talking about, Potter's Field, that people had been just buried in mass graves. So, of course, there's no way to know, those numbers, but at least to be able to get a closer figure. And then also, we have so many people that reach out to us through Facebook and say, hey, my great-grandmother was buried here. Do you know where? And, and I'll try and go through and see what I have. But, typically we don't have a photo for those headstones. So it would be so great to have somebody and at least maybe be able to direct them to something. Yes, this is a
And I
thought.
think another downfall for us also is that I think the courthouse that housed some of the information regarding the cemetery, it caught fire, I think in the early 60s, late 60s or something like that. And they lost, all the records were lost as to where each grave, which person was in which grave, what plot. So you don't know what plot of the land or anything where they are if they didn't have a headstone. And as I said earlier, some of the headstones have been crushed by trees. So we don't know where those headstones go. And we don't know who actually reside in those graves. I walked the cemetery for about a good 5 miles, taking rest along the way. And there's graves even deeper back into
Mhm.
those woods that there's tombstones here and there sporadically. So that means that there has been tombstones back there that have been destroyed by weather or an act of nature. A tree may have fallen on it or encroachment. So you never know.
Yeah, Tammy,
So we've
as
got a couple of things.
oh, and Tammy, as Lois noted, a major focus of a work was starting from the winter time through the spring, was working along a component, an element, an area of the cemetery that likely has been untouched since the 1960s. And it's this, as you peer deeply, actually even not so deeply into the woods, you can see the row of tombstones and indentions and those elements which signify that their bodies buried into that direction. We don't even know how far that goes. So,
Mhm.
so a major part of our work. I mean, now that it's summertime, some of that pushing deeper into nature is really doesn't happen simply because, as we know, sun shines, there's warmer days, there's more water, and the grass grows.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Beth,
Absolutely.
You're gonna say?
And the
Yeah, because
other thing that we're
I've been
batting,
to the cemetery a couple of times. I think maybe 3 times at the times I visit
Huh.
Chattanooga. And
Interesting.
the times I went, it was very wooded and everything like that. And I, went as far as I could to I found the resting place of Ed Johnson. I found that. But just going around, I just like to look at the headstones and look at the symbols and the names and stuff like that. And I want to go a little bit further into it, but I didn't want to, you know, walk into a sunken, depressed grave or
yeah,
anything like that. But yes, it's a lot there.
Hmm.
there is. And we're also, so we're battling, and some of the parts, as Donovan says, have not even been touched, because we rely on volunteer groups. And a lot of times, as Lois had referenced, we've worked for several years now with Macaulay School. It's a boarding school for young boys, gentlemen, young adults. Um, and so we've had some volunteers that will come over, and that's usually during the school season. And we do pretty good with them, but you're talking about 10 or 12, maybe 15 young men. And so, you're limited as to what you can do. And then you've got the other thing. So you clear a little bit of ground, but all this acreage up here that's already been cleared, it's growing up again. So it's just it's a constant battle. Um, and then, so it's always an ongoing issue right now. The other thing that we struggle with, or something else that Lois mentioned, was encroachment. And so that's been an issue, especially in the early 1900s. G.W. Franklin did kind of like a land swap, some of the acreage. He swapped with a gentleman, Paul Shepherd, who owned a dairy farm. On that, when you first turn in, like, it's called Ridgeside. So it's the road that you turn down and then you turn onto Row Road. So at one time, Ridgeside was known as Rogers Road, and they had a dairy farm back there. Well, Paul Shepherd and his brother wanted to start to subdivide that land. And so they did. And that was part of the switch or the swap that they made with G.W. Franklin. Well, when they did that, they put in the covenant that essentially only white people could live there. And they, specifically identified certain groups. And so at the time, there had been also African American people who owned land, had farms there. There was a church back. They were basically driven out of there. So what you have now is this cemetery that now is sitting all around these subdivisions and neighborhoods, and Ridgeside, that was the name of the area. Yeah, they vehemently, they didn't want the cemetery as part of their city or incorporation and everything. So that's on that road, you're in Ridgeside, but once you turn on to Road Road, you're in Chattanooga again.
Okay.
So it's, it's just, and so now
And Beth,
the
I
thing
wanna
that
say,
we're,
and there's a legacy, and it's not as if this community relationship, this historical dynamic, which is rooted in the past, it remains rooted in the present.
Yes.
So imagine you might have a relative buried in the cemetery, and you would be an African American if that was the case. And there's only one way into the cemetery, and that one way is through a community that you may not feel welcome to be within. With that being said, some of our volunteers are from the community. David Young, who's had the most tremendous investment laboring in the cemetery, he lives in the cemetery. But just want to say, collectively speaking, there are things that are not forgotten about this dynamic.
Okay.
Yes.
completely.
So, and Beth, you were saying, I didn't want to cut you off. I just want to interject that dynamic to affirm what you were saying.
Well, I'm not
That
even
was
sure.
eloquently said.
So, what was that, Lois? I'm sorry.
I'm in my head. I said that was eloquently said. I like that, Donovan. Thank you.
And he's good at that. He's very good at that. So besides mapping the cemetery, other things that we're doing right now is it's important for us that the cemetery be recognized as an historic place. And so we're going through, we're working with Middle Tennessee State University to have the cemetery nominated to the National Register of Historic Places. And that's been, I guess we've been going through the process since 2019. We had the first draft submitted about a year ago, waited, and then we finally got word, I guess about 2 months ago, that the Tennessee Historical Commission was having questions, and that regarded ownership. So we know there's these people who descended from Levi Young. Some of them say, yes, they're owners of the cemetery, but they say that there are other family members who aren't. But as far as any kind of document or will or anything recorded in the courthouse, there's nothing. So that's the question that's holding us up right now. We think that, we've got a way around that, and we've talked to the family about that, and Donovan can certainly, address just our relationship with the family and how that's evolved. But yeah, so that's a big thing for us right now is getting nominated and hopefully, maybe making us eligible to apply for, federal grants or other things like that. And also just protecting the cemetery and the grounds that are there. That's critical in my mind.
It's crucial.
Okay, so I'm going to thank you, Beth. You had sent me some photos, so I just want the guest on here to see some of the photos that you have submitted. I had added a few of mine. Can you all see it?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so actually
that's
this
the
here is one of my photos. Ooh, let me go back. Entering the cemetery because I had passed it a few times and I thought I was lost. So
Yes.
and so these are some of the photos. Thank you, Beth, for sending these to me. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
I like that. It looks like it was carved or something like that.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, we have so many. It's like every time I go up there, I see something that I haven't seen before. I see a headstone, something like that, like I say, have not seen before. And so I just think that, whoever made that, and it looks like in 1975, so it's really.
Yeah, I appreciate you showing the last one. I had not seen that before. I mean, there's so many. And like Beth said, each time I go up there, I see something new, a new headstone. And
Yeah.
And it's always the ones that tend to catch my eye are the ones that were buried post the late 1960s. So this is really interesting. 1975.
Yeah. Yeah. That looks like etching or something like that on there.
Yeah, it does.
Mhm. This one shows an example. Unfortunately, the trees are also, they're a constant, something we're constantly aware of. Slightest little wind, or if this was just during COVID, we had a tornado come through this area, and it took out, it went across the cemetery. So you had several trees down. And when that happens, many times it will fall on a grave. And so we've got a couple of open graves right now that we need to be dealt with, but we haven't been able to. Unfortunately, during that tornado, it knocked out power on that ridge side. So when the utility company came up, they drove up in the cemetery, and they actually drove on some graves. So they then did damage. So it's just, as I said, it's ongoing.
Okay.
Just another interesting headstone. And you see, it looks like someone, maybe they made this stone and then they carved, or maybe when the cement was wet, etched their name in. And then the other little, that insert there with the name Austin on it. Fascinating. Of course, this is Ed Johnson's grave.
And is this the original headstone? Because I know that someone passed away. They had an unmarked grave for several years or decades. Then some people raised money. So is this the original one?
I do not know. And that's kind of a mystery.
Okay.
So we don't know when this was. Now, when he was buried, there was a marker put there. But when you go back and you're, researching, trying to find different obituaries or news stories, there's an interesting article, and it was a couple of years after he was buried, that talks about an Eastview cemetery. And the description of that headstone sounds like it was an obelisk. So that have not been able to find anything else about Eastview. We've seen newspaper articles from the 1970s in which someone is quoted as saying, that Eastview backed up to Pleasant Garden, and at one time they were just, basically Pleasant Garden took over Eastview. But as far as anything like any actual original documents verifying that, no. So I asked Middle Tennessee State, how do we know? Do we know this is and they were like, we don't. We just don't know.
Okay.
And just one quick moment to expound upon something Beth said. When we reference Middle Tennessee State, within Middle Tennessee State, they have an entity called the Center for Historic Preservation. And they work throughout the region to assist individuals, families, and communities who are seeking to understand that which is within their domain, which is of historical significance. They help them preserve that, and it can even assist with helping them find funding to do so. The guy who runs it, Dr. Carol Van West, he's seen and revered and respected by so many folks that before John Lewis passed away, John Lewis gave him a tour of prominent historical African-American sites in Nashville. So they do really wonderful work throughout the region and even up into Utah at this point.
Okay, thank you so much, Donivan.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Again, another interesting example.
Yeah, very interesting.
Mm-hmm. The little baby's grave.
And the name Handsome C.
Yeah.
Boyd.
Handsome.
Well, sometimes they did that when babies died and they didn't give them a real name.
Okay,
They
that's
would say,
good to know.
Yes, they would say lovely or handsome or
Mhm.
beautiful, something like that, because they didn't want to just give them a name, because if it was like a legacy, they wanted to leave that name if they had another child coming along. So that's why they did that.
Okay. And there was a
Okay.
question I
So
want
here,
to ask. Sorry, real quick.
yeah,
How many of the Scottsboro boys are buried there at Pleasant Grove? Let me say Pleasant Garden. I'm
okay.
sorry.
So officially, we know that Leroy Wright is buried there. We've got an obituary, we have a headstone, but community believes that Andrew is also buried there. They were brothers. Um, not been able to find an obituary, news articles, anything at all. So, and some people here in the community, I mean, vehemently believe it. So we've tried to start prefacing, when we talk about Leroy Wright being there, we add, and possibly his brother Andrew. So,
Beth, would that
yeah, they
be
were two
on
brothers.
microfiche at the public library, maybe?
No, not that I'm aware of. Um, right, and it's believed when I talk to, and it's Lois. Let me back that up. Not that I've been able to find. So,
Oh, I'm check and see if I can dig into
the
that.
doctoral candidate who's doing the research and doing all the, I guess, putting together the nomination, I had asked her about this, and I know she did a search just trying to find, and I'm trying to remember where he was during the time of when Leroy died, because of course when Leroy died, news media started reaching out to Andrew, basically hounding him again. These young men, they were hounded all of their lives. None of them had good outcomes. Um, so it just kind of felt that maybe Andrew just didn't want to be found,
Mhm.
anymore. And, maybe even he was using a different name or something. So just kind of speculation. So, but again, that's another mystery. Where is he? Is he buried here in
Mhm.
Pleasant Garden? Just, cannot find anything to confirm or, disprove.
So
So,
he may be buried somewhere under a presumed name
or
of
he could be
somebody
buried.
else. Yeah.
I would imagine he's probably buried up north
Hmm.
somewhere. In researching him, he had been married and he did have children, even though the marriage had been, ended in divorce. So at one time we were kind of looking through that way, would they have known? And just wasn't able, just basically kept running into dead ends with it. Um, and that's it. I guess that's the other thing about Pleasant Garden.
Mhm.
So you have gentlemen like Ed Johnson and then Leroy Wright. And there are many, many other stories here of just horrific, horrific stories. But then you also have stories because this cemetery was a lot of the people that were buried there were well-to-do business people here
Hmm.
in Chattanooga. And that's, you look to the right and the left of Leroy Wright's picture, that's the obelisk in which Donovan was referring to. It's also the grave of T.W. Franklin. And on this picture on the left, you see the inscriptions there. So that shows the date it was founded, when it was organized, and then it identifies R.L. Klieg, who was the founder, and the 13 gentlemen who were also on the board of directors at that time. So,
Okay.
Yeah. Additionally, there just recently one of our a woman named Stephanie Hare, who is think finishing a PhD at MTSU, focused her studies on a man named Horace Brazelton, who is actually buried within Pleasant Garden Cemetery. He was a notable photographer. His focus was on African Americans and did portrait photography. And beyond this, function as a business person, was also another community member, a community leader who was known for his generosity, right, and his desire to pave the way for other young African Americans to enter into the field of photography. So Horace Brazelton is another noteworthy name there. Certainly everyone buried, everyone living and everyone who's deceased is of importance. And there are those folks who come along who gain some greater sense of community significance. And he's one of those folks. I think as well, Beth had referenced the family relationships. Like Beth and I, when we started out the organizing work at Pleasant Garden Cemetery, we had been told by someone in the community that there was a nearby family member who didn't want to be contacted and associated with the cemetery in any way. And there's things that we can do as volunteers. There's ways which we could organize work days with other volunteers. However, given some of the need and for repair, certain kind of professionals need access from family members granted to them. Additionally, even for MTSU to do their work, they had to get permission from the family.
Mhm.
And eventually we made contact. I think it was late 2019, and then our meetings kept falling through. And then in the midst of our society's apocalypse of what was happening in COVID in 2020, family member based in Cleveland, Tennessee, which is roughly 35 minutes from Chattanooga, reached out and said that she had reached out to some other family members and wanted to meet. So in December 2020 on Zoom, there were family from Cleveland, Tennessee, Atlanta, Georgia, Houston, Texas, as well as San Luis Obispo, California. And some of the folks had not been in contact with each other since the 1970s. So we marveled at the fact that we were experiencing a family reunion. And we'd learned along the way that for many private cemeteries, particularly private African-American cemeteries, you have generations of family members who owned and ran the cemetery, had a certain skill set, and they were working day to day. And like many families, people dispersed throughout the region, throughout the country. So there are people who are born and exist and who are alive that have no idea that they themselves are owners of cemeteries and are by default in the state of Tennessee legally responsible to care for that cemetery. And the same is true for the young family dispersed throughout the country. And since this first meeting we had with them, we've engaged with family members from Los Angeles, California, as well as Brooklyn, New York. So they are really willing to take on the challenge of being responsible for the massive undertaking of Pleasant Garden Cemetery.
Okay. All right. So we got 6 minutes left. And so I want to ask each one of you, what can be done to proactively preserve these historical sites, and what would you like to see happen to Pleasant Garden Cemetery in the future?
How about Lois, you go first, given the fact you have family buried there? What's your vision for the cemetery?
I would love to find my family members where they are. And we preserve the cemetery to a level of excellence where we can go and enjoy being there, and they can enjoy resting there. Have walkways instead of trails, and just renovate it and make it look beautiful like it once was, because I think it has the essence that it was a beautiful cemetery at one time. And I would like for us to restore it back that way, and that would be my wish of what we could make happen. That's my desire.
Thank you, Lois.
Hey, Beth, you to go next.
Let me go next. Okay. And so the question was basically, what kind of things are we hoping for or wanting to happen with the cemetery? Of course, just looking at least in this area, as far as all African American cemeteries, we have several cemeteries that are in this kind of shape. They're not anywhere as big, maybe like an acre, maybe a little less. but they're now in woods, essentially, completely grown up. And we've got several of those. And then we have several that I know have not been fully identified. So that would be one of the things. I would like us to have a comprehensive list of where these cemeteries are, what condition they're in. I'd like to have people working in each of them. As far as Pleasant Garden itself, number one is being added to the National Historic Register. Then also is the mapping project. I really want us to have a database. I just think that would be so helpful to families who are searching. Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is I want us to have a survey. That's also at my list. Because again, protecting the boundaries that we have right now. And then I guess the other thing is just being able to completely restore, preserve. And if y'all haven't figured out, I could talk a long, long time about the cemetery, and so I'm sorry. The other thing, I guess this is my big grand, after all this has happened, and everything, I would love to envision that every year maybe we would have some kind of like homecoming days in which families would be invited to come, and maybe they would work on their, ancestors' plots, and they would have maybe a lunch there, something like that. So I
That
just
would
want
be
it to be
great.
able to be returned to a place where people know that it's there, people go
Yes.
and visit it, and and that families feel like they're welcome again. So
Thank you,
Yes.
Beth.
It's
Jonathan?
interesting. There's really not much more to be said. I think I'll reiterate that in this instance, we are thinking about the past being future, that this place being what it once was, a grand place. Even though when you visit there, you can see the horror, you can see the haunting, you can also see that there've been generations, I think 2-3 generations of community efforts. And sometimes our greatest efforts are not completely being victorious over nature in this instance, but it's keeping at bay some of the growth. And ideally, it would be wonderful that we might be just the last community organization that has to be organized to care for Pleasant Garden Cemetery, that we work to cultivate something that to preserve post restoration, that it's restored, that it's preserved in perpetuity. Additionally, I think that these kinds of upendings provide, I think, moral and community hauntings. When the places where our dead of our loved ones aren't cared for, and it can be for any number of reasons, I think it's its own kind of moral quagmire, quandary, and haunting. And I think it's incumbent upon each generation to take up the mantle to, and every generation, there's things that we're passed down that are both burdens and blessings, and sometimes they're both and this is both, I think, a collective burden for the community, certainly for the family, but it being repaired, restored, and preserved, I think will make the souls of many in our community quite well.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, Beth, Donovan, and Lois, thank you so much for being on Black Race Matter. I really, really appreciate it. Just to let you all know, and also our guests, I am the co-chair of Friends of Baroque Cemetery. And we've been working for the past couple of years to work with the owners. Emmett Till's buried there, Mamie Till Mobley, Lorraine Hansberry's father is buried there. So we have a lot of history there. And we're also working to make sure that becomes a historic landmark as well. So,
Tammy,
yes,
what's
yes,
the location of that cemetery?
it's an Alsip. It's on 127. It's right up a 294 Expressway.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. So we've been working with them for the past
Thank you.
couple of years too, because we had issues with flooding. Now we have issues with the markers. They're like woods made out of stakes, and they use markers to do the sections. So we're trying to work with them to find better ways to people to work, family to look for their loved ones. We have a kiosk that's been broken for several months, and like for Mother's Day and Father's Day, the people came there Sunday, could not find their loved ones, so we was out there trying to help them as well. So again, I'd like to thank you all for being on Black Race Matter. Next month, I'm going to have Miss Ganelle Brady. She is the founder of Our Mammy, and she's also working, and she has loved ones buried at Hope Cemetery in New Orleans. And so I'll be posting a flyer for my interview with her next month. But thank you all so much. And I plan to go back to visit Chattanooga. So if I do, I'll definitely look you up. And also, if there's any type of events happening or you need volunteers, I'm a travel historian. So I travel everywhere. Please let me know, and I'll definitely come out and support and help.
Oh,
Thank you.
awesome. Thank
Excellent.
you.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank
you
you
all
so
have
much.
a great day. Take care.
You have an awesome day. Thank you,
Yeah,
Tammy.
take
You
care.
too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye.